Town of Burlington Planning Department. I just want to thank everyone for coming out this morning. The town was awarded a $26,000 grant to put a plan together to prepare for climate change. So this community workshop today is part of the planning process, and some of the information gathered here today will be incorporated into that plan. Once that plan is completed, hopefully in a couple months, it will be submitted to the state, and the goal is to become designated MVP community by the state. And with this designation, the town will be eligible for grant funding opportunities for projects with climate change. I'm now going to hand it off to Jeff Malloy and his great team from the BSC Gruoup who have been consultants on this project. And they're going to share more about the program and what we'll be doing today. But thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so thanks everyone for being here today. This is a really important initiative that the state is involved with, so we're happy to be working with your community on this effort. So being here is really important. So again, thank you. Thank you for coming today. We're going to try to make this as interactive and as fun as possible, so you're not sitting here for the next 4 hours. We're going to have a series of activities that we're going to do, some breaks through the day. So, and again, at any moment, if you have a question, please ask, okay? Don't feel like you need to just sit and listen. Next slide. So here's our agenda for today. Again, ask any questions. Pieces of this are confusing at times, so don't hesitate. We're going to, at around 11, break into some interactive workstations. We have some computer monitors set up. The state has developed a really cool website. They call it the Massachusetts Climate Change Clearinghouse, and it's where they're bringing all the climate data that's being developed through the state and through the state's communities into one place. And what they've also done is they've provided what's called downscaled climate data that you can use to undertake your planning processes within the community. So we're going to do that. We've also drawn upon some really good work that the MAPC, Metropolitan Area Planning Council, has done with your community through your hazard mitigation planning process. So what we've done is they've given us that data, and we've turned that data into an interactive GIS platform. So you'll be able to zoom into areas within the community, see the hazardous categories or characteristics or ecological characteristics within your community, and see how it relates to certain things we talk about today. And then we're going to have some lunch, and we're going to please have snacks whenever you can see snacks over here. Lunch will be delivered around noon. And then after lunch, we're going to break out into 3 groups of approximately 10 people at each table, and we're going to go through a brainstorming session. So what you'll see is on your tables there are some handouts. There is an agenda, which looks like this, and on the back side of the agenda there are these really, I call it a cheat sheet, okay? So we're going to be developing solutions today that can help us address the categories of hazards that exist within the community, okay? And we'll talk more about that shortly. This is just a cheat sheet of some solutions that we can apply to these challenges, okay? And so what the core team has been doing, and I'll explain what the core team is in a moment, is they have developed solutions already, okay? So we've been working with the community for the last 6 months to identify the hazards within your community, categories of infrastructural, societal, and environmental features that exist within your community, and then assigning solutions to them. And what you'll also have is a blank sheet that is similar to the form that has been preliminarily filled out. Any questions at this point? Okay, so, sure.
How do we get this registered? We can apply for it?
Yeah, so I'm moving into that now, yeah. So what the state did is climate change planning within the state of Massachusetts has mostly been occurring along the coastline. And what facilitated that process, or what led to that process, was the development of a model that Mass Department of Transportation paid to have developed to conduct a vulnerability assessment for the Central Artery Tunnel, the Big Dig Tunnel, right? So a model was developed to plan for what climate change and sea level rise specifically is going to look like for the Central Artery Tunnel. That model has now been used along the entire coastline of Massachusetts. Most of the communities have applied that model. That model is a very data-driven, technocratic. It was expensive to build it first, but it's, you know, with the economy of scale, it's been applied in all the communities. The state we don't have a way to model inland communities the way we do for coastlines. So what the state did is they developed this program, the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, which is a stakeholder-driven engagement approach to the vulnerability and climate change planning process. So yes, your community applied for a grant and received $26,000 to do this process. It's a year-long process. It ends in June 30th of 2019. And what will be done is a findings report. I'll talk more about this in a minute. A report is prepared, and then there's a public listening session that ends the process. So funds are being put towards what you're trying to do here is to achieve community designation, MVP designation. And what that designation does for you is it positions you for grant funding through the MVP program, and the state is trying to tie other grant programs to designation, MVP designation. So you will establish eligibility for other forms of funding through the state. This is a map seeing well, we all know what the state of Massachusetts looks like. The blue municipalities are the communities that have received designation. The light blue communities are the fiscal year 18-19 participants. This is your community. And then there were also regional partnerships. Some communities worked with other municipalities to earn their designation. So 68 communities were designated in year one, I think, about that number. About 85 communities are being designated in the 18-19. Burlington is one of those. So about half of the states will have been designated by June of 2019, okay? So outcomes of the process. We've already talked about designation. The state, when you earn designation, the state is then allocating money through what they're calling the MVP Action Grant money. So this is much larger dollar amounts. They allocated $5 million to the communities that were designated in the first year of the program to implement. You're going to try to implement the solutions that you helped to develop today. Okay, these are implementation grants, if you think about them that way. They're called action grants. You will receive increased competitiveness for other grant programs. So as I said, the state wants to make your MVP designation a piece of the eligibility for other grant programs in the state. Public education and awareness. This is a big, big initiative for the state. We want everyone to start thinking about these issues. Baseline information for future planning and implementation efforts, and best management practices for resiliency within your community. So what have we been doing? The core team first met in September of 2018. I'd say there's probably 8 members on our core team. They represent individuals from various municipal departments within the community. We held a second core team meeting in November, and then we held a expanded core team meeting, which was also workshop number 1. That was held in January of 2019. Today is March 6th, and thank you all again for being here for this larger effort. And then we are going to hold a third workshop at a date to be determined. The last two pieces of the process are the development of a findings report. We are going to take all the information that we gather from you today and turn it into, it's a vulnerability assessment because we're identifying vulnerabilities within your community. It's called a findings report because it also has solutions for how to address these issues. It takes the vulnerability planning process, and takes it a step further. So that's what we're trying to achieve today. And then finally, there's a public listening session, which is the community is invited at large to attend. Like, we're going to notify everyone in the community and say, please come and hear about what we did for the last year. So this slide is the first time anyone is seeing this slide. We're working with a few other communities on this process. And what we've heard from some communities is there's still a question between what weather and climate is. I don't know if anyone wants to take a stab at how you feel about this question, or, typically, as you see on the slide here, weather is the day-to-day state of the atmosphere. As it's short-term variation in minutes to weeks, climate is weather over longer periods of time. When we think about climate change, we think about climate as 30-year increments. So weather is what we expect to see, or climate is what we expect to see, and weather is what we experience on a day-to-day basis. It's a simple fact, but it's important when we talk to people because there's still some confusion here with this concept. And we don't need to go into that any further, but again, just an important point. So what's happening is your community is experiencing changes in climate reflected as weather, and it's largely driven by temperature, precipitation, extreme weather. We call this climate exposure. So what the projections are telling us over the next 30 years or so is we're going to see an increase in temperatures. For example, temperature extremes over 90 degrees, where we could see between 10 and 30 days per year of 90-degree temperatures. Okay, last year we saw 11 days, and the year before it was pretty close to that. So the projections are really playing out as has been predicted. Annual precipitation is another one, between 1 and 23% increase in precipitation. So 1%, is that really so bad? Or 23, that could be pretty tough. But the way these events are experienced are usually in extreme events. So even if we're at 10% increase in annual precipitation, if those events fall within fewer rainstorm events over extreme precipitation events, let's say, extreme events, is your infrastructure prepared to handle those types of events? If it falls as snow, is our emergency response or preparedness ready to deal with those types of events? So that's kind of what we want to think about. And really what it is climate change is challenging the ways that community resources are managed. I heard a really interesting thing recently where someone was telling me that in their community, since the 1970s, they've always collected leaves. The community has done leaf pickup on the same date since the 70s. But the leaves are falling off trees later in the year now, okay? But they're still picking up leaves at the same date, same time of year. So what they were finding in the community is the leaves weren't being picked up as well as they should be, and they were washing into rain gutters, into catch basins, and clogging them up, which was exacerbating the flooding events and not even bigger rainstorm events, the same rainstorm events we've always seen. So it's these little tiny things sometimes that are the easy solutions that can address the issues that we're starting to see. We do have a dollar amount on this slide where there's been no deaths, but since 96 to 2015, there's been 76 flood events within Middlesex County, about $41 million of damage since 96 through flooding events. So next slide. So again, the point here is we're gradually changing the distribution of risk. how we need to think about risk within your community. So the way this program works is there's a framework that's been developed, okay? And the framework is this big 11 by 17 sheet you see in front of you, and we don't need to dig into that yet. But the point is, what it asks you to do, what the framework asks us to do, is to first identify hazards. And you can see there's a horizontal line across the top where the community has identified, the core team meeting has taken the hazards that we know exist and identified the priority hazards that we want to think about. So the core team has identified heat waves, flooding, snow, and drought. And there's obviously some overlaps with these hazards, right? So a flooding event and a snow event can be the same depending on what time of the year they occur, right? Lots of rain falls as snow. A heat wave leads to drought. So there's overlaps here. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking about these solutions today, because the solutions can overlap the types of hazards we're thinking about. The framework also then asks us to categorize community vulnerabilities and strengths. Go to the next slide for me. Oh, well, so I beat it. Go back one. Pardon. So what we do is we categorize community vulnerabilities and strengths. And this, please, go ahead. Right. Right, so the idea is that the precipitation events, let's say our annual precipitation increases over the course of the year. If most of that rain falls in fewer larger events, then you could have periods of drought. So the climate's always changing, right? We know this. So, and we experienced 2 to 3 years ago, we were in the middle of a 2-year drought. There's a lot of water on the ground now. So we're always going to follow these cycles, right? Drought will be exacerbated if the precipitation is falling in faster events, where less water is being, stored in wetlands. And answer your question, or? Yeah, I mean, so also keep in mind that there's a lot of variability in what the projections tell us, okay? So as we think about these numbers, and there's also data, were those circulated already? Okay, yeah, so we're gonna introduce you to some data today that the state has prepared and provided to all the communities as part of this process. You'll see that there is a decent amount of variability as we move into the future, which makes sense, right? Predicting a rainstorm a few, 15 years from now, you really can't do. So, go ahead.
Well, I guess it seems to me that one of the key things to think about with all of these extreme events,
Right.
that we're not talking about it being a little bit warmer or a little bit more snow or a little bit more drought. We're talking about the weather being much more varied, with a lot of extreme events going on, more so than we're used to experiencing. The analogy I think of is that there are years when the stock market just kind of goes up and down, going up here like last year, those people, stock holders who experienced it, where the stock market's going up and down 300 points, 500 points, and stuff like that. And I think that climate change means that you've got these up and down events going on.
And you just articulated your question much better than I did, so thank you. Yeah, yeah, and it's extremes, right? We're dealing with extremes, but ultimately the point is, I think it's less important for us today to think about we're going to have a 10% increase in annual precipitation versus a 25% increase in annual precipitation in the year 2050. It's thinking about what extreme events may look like and how we're going to prepare for that. So then finally, in the matrix, we identify hazards, we identify categories or features within your community. These are infrastructural features, or categories. These are societal features or categories, and these are environmental categories. Go ahead.
Two questions going back several categories about the grants. An increasing number of communities competing for a pot of money, the same size pot of money that on the state legislature.
Can you say that again? I couldn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Talking about additional grants we qualify for.
Right.
So you said there were 68 communities, now 85, so we're talking roughly 150 communities now, but we all, a greater number of communities competing for money from the same size pot of money that we're dependent upon the state legislature to put it up.
So, good question, and I have a partial answer for you. So, yeah, so I don't know how much money they are going to allocate towards the action grants. So if your community is designated, which you will be in June, we don't know yet how much money is going to be in that pot for applying into the action grant program. Last year it was $5 million. It was the first year of the program. Yeah, 68 communities were eligible for $5 million. This will be year 2, so will it be 150 communities eligible for $5 million, or will it be 7, or will it be 10? We don't know yet. What I can tell you is that in year 1 of the program, the communities, the amount of money for the designation process, this is the process you're going through right now, the 68 to 86, the dollar value went up.
The second question is matrix. Are they prioritized or are they just in random order?
Is what prioritized?
This matrix list.
So nothing is, there's no prioritized yet. They're randomized. Yeah, so it's ordered by infrastructural, societal, and environmental features, it's called, or think of it as categories. So if you flip, you'll see a header on the horizontal. But the items in that, we are trying to prioritize today. That's something we're thinking about. Yeah, not yet. Any other questions? Go ahead.
In the line of prioritization, there's one particular problem that might be a way to connect all of the interior towns, at least those that are tied to the metropolitan area. We have a single sewage system for Great Bay towns. That sewage system happens to be sitting in water at the tail end. That processing system may have been designed for a so-called 1,000-year flood, maybe it's a 500 or 100 flood. If that system, for whatever reason, major event goes down, we have a huge public health problem that connects all of the communities together. We have so far been talking about these grants being applied to a variety of towns with no interconnection between them, where everybody ought to be participating together in resolving a particular situation. I think this one is of particular importance and should be highlighted as a way of prioritizing, I would put it, if not 1A.
Right, and so there are opportunities to apply for grants through regional partnerships. So you can work with local communities, your adjacent communities, to think about, applying for grant money to address that. And I completely agree with you. That's a great comment. Was there a question component to that I missed, or? And so what I'd say is this is the opportunity to get that idea onto this matrix today. Yeah. Sure.
The word prioritization allows you to think that this not is a single community problem, it is a collective problem for everybody.
Right. I agree. Yeah, so next slide. So this is our little break in the presentation for 5 minutes, and we're starting to talk a little bit. What we want to do is just take some notes and talk among the group collectively about what do we feel are the hazards that are most important to be thinking about within your community. So you'll recall that the core team has identified flooding, and heat waves and drought and extreme snow events as the hazards they want to be thinking about. Is there anything else that anyone has in mind that you want to bring up now? Go ahead.
This might go back to the weather versus climate. Would you consider hurricane as weather? In a sense?
Sure, yeah, hurricane event, so, right, so there's, you know, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty too much, but there's, you know, climate exposure is the weather event that you're subject to, but the effects are, like flooding isn't the exposure. The precipitation event is the exposure. So climate change is bringing more precipitation, but the hazard itself is the flooding. The hazard of drought presents hazard because your drinking water supply may be diminished, or droughts are usually associated with high temperatures. They can be. High temperatures bring challenges to electric distribution systems, infrastructure. They also are a public health issue. So I haven't gotten quite to this point, but it's a good question that you bring up now. I'm really going to press everyone today. It's a harder way to think about this process, but about the idea of co-benefits. We want to come up with solutions that address multiple issues. You're going to hear that term a lot today. We're going to press you on it. Co-benefits. Think about that. Solutions that address multiple hazards at once. And again, this is what we want to do to position your community for future grant funding. You want to demonstrate to the state that you're thinking about solutions that's going to address more than one issue within your community. So thank you. Good question. Go ahead.
I just have a technical. So this room is kind of hard to hear from us, like sort of on the other side of the room if someone asks a question. So
Do you want me to?
can you either repeat the question someone asked
Sure.
if you don't have a microphone, or Josh has a microphone if you want to use it to make sure everyone can hear?
Or stand.
So I just, so the acoustics are not awesome.
Sure.
Awesome, thanks.
Given this list here, the flooding, drought, heat wave, and snow, I feel like it doesn't really include everything. I mean, extreme weather events.
Sure.
So it might be a heat wave, it might be a big snowstorm, it might be, but there could be a big wind event that knocks over so many trees that people, the emergency vehicles can't get to where they're going, or you know, those kinds of things. So I would like to see it a little bit more inclusive.
Sure. And so, could you hear that question with the mic? Okay, yeah. So you are not limited to the hazards that the core team has identified. Okay? We can expand upon this. We can reduce it. Again, it's a challenging task because these hazards overlap. Okay? So you can do whatever you want to do when you define these hazards and solutions. It's really up to the community to identify what you'd like to do. Go ahead. So the question was, do we include air quality issues with issues like heat wave? So air quality is going to become one of the features, the categories. This is on the left side, the vertical axis. So air quality, you know, and you can define how you want that to. I would put it in the societal category. It could, but there's also an environmental category. Yes, and it more broadly falls into the public health category. So what we want to do again today is generate ideas, solutions, and then we're going to work to categorize and refine and get all the solutions that you come up with into a place where we can turn it into a report form that reflects the community's needs and wants. Go ahead.
It strikes me that not being coastal, sea level rise not an issue. Not being agricultural, drought is not a life or death issue in this community the way it's in some. But the two areas I see are there's a lot of low-lying areas where flooding seems like an obvious risk. There's a number of roads that are barely above the surrounding wetlands. So in a catastrophic rain event, I can see a number of roads being impassable. And as was just brought up, if you're looking at extreme events, we're probably not gonna see a tornado right away like we just had in the south, but there was a fairly serious tornado in Worcester a few years ago. So clearly the town, with a lot of trees over the wires, is extremely vulnerable to the possibility of an extreme wind event. So those are the things I would think about flooding.
Right, so, yeah, so, again, this group has the flexibility to frame your hazards and your solutions however you'd like. So if extreme weather events broadly is the hazard that is most appropriate, that's okay. And that can encompass things like tornadoes. It could include drought. Drought is an extreme climate weather event. The core team has thought a great deal about flooding to date, and you'll see a category on there. It's among the top ones under the infrastructural category for roads. And they've identified roads that are located within flooding areas. One of the solutions is to do a townwide assessment on roads that fall within floodplain. Now, again, here's my co-benefit term. Which of those roads are within emergency access routes? Which of those roads fall within areas where socially vulnerable populations may be located, like an assisted living facility, let's say? Okay, so this is an infrastructural issue with a solution that addresses a societal issue. And say you want to, when you address the roads that are subject to flooding, you want to introduce some nature-based solutions, green infrastructure. Now you've got an environmental piece, and you've got a really nice grant application to submit to the state. Okay, so again, co-benefits is the term we want to talk about here today. It's more challenging, as I said earlier, to develop solutions, thinking in that manner, but it's key. It's really, really important. I saw a question over here earlier. No more? Anyone else? Go ahead.
The federal government has some guidelines and resources available to communities to look at floodplains and take specific actions that reduce that flood insurance coverage.
Right.
Do we have access to that kind of resource, or is that too specific and too broad?
So the question was, do we have access to certain resources such as federal documentation, planning, those types of resources to help us with developing ideas such as co-benefits? You have access to anything that's publicly available at this point. I'm not sure I totally know how to answer your question, because you can use whatever resources you'd like. We don't necessarily have them today. We have laptops and we can pull up resources as we're discussing today.
Yeah, so like one example would be that instead of looking at a 100-year floodplain, to go to a 500-year floodplain, and if we expand the size of our culvert, for example, that would be maybe a priority in certain areas. So there's a really robust list
Right.
of specific activities. So the question is, when we talk about solutions, I mean, that really actually helps kind of prompt creativity.
Sure. Yeah, so we don't have those for us to use today. We have, and I didn't introduce all the BSC employees in the room today, but we have a group of people that understand this stuff well. We're going to be at each of the tables, so hopefully we can facilitate that process. Go ahead.
Also, during the next session, we are going to be running a PowerPoint that's all about solutions. So there's about 40 slides with examples that could be applicable in your community. And we also have some handouts. We don't have copies for everybody, but these are also like cheat sheet of ideas from climate resiliency and some of it from the EPA as well. So we do have some examples to kind of get you thinking about some potential solutions for Burlington.
The back of your agenda also has some solutions on it as well. So does anyone else want to talk hazards? And again, we're going to be mostly doing this today. We just wanted to kind of get a feel for what the group was thinking about here. Okay, so let's move on because we're behind. So again, I mentioned earlier, we've got this framework that we're all functioning within today, right? We identify our hazards, We identify our categories of community risks. Strengths or vulnerabilities is the way the framework frames them. Some of the categories within your community, they can serve, it's an and/or condition. It can serve as a vulnerability or a strength. So an example of this is the commercial district in the middle of your community. You've got malls, you've got supermarkets. Now, there's lots of pavement around your commercial districts, right? This is a source of urban heat island effect. You get a really hot day, it's much hotter around these paved areas. That puts a stressor on the electrical distribution systems. If there was a power outage within your community, the mall or the supermarkets could serve as shelters. A supermarket, for example, has backup generators, it has food, it has Wi-Fi connections, so it's a resource for the community to use in an event. So this is one of these types of co-benefits that we can be thinking about. How can we maybe reduce pavement within your commercial districts and enhance the resources within your community to serve as shelter areas or assembly areas? Okay, so again, remember we've got vulnerabilities and strengths when we think about these infrastructural, societal, and environmental features. And then we want to develop solutions. So we've gotten into this a little bit, but these are just some examples of common types of built infrastructure. Roads, bridges, dams, critical municipal facilities. If you have critical municipal facilities that are in the floodplain that serve as, let's say, a emergency response center, you've got a problem, right? So those are just some examples. Some flooding is an issue in every single inland community. Flooding is the central feature for every single inland community we've been working with. Okay, so I've actually broken out a specific category, water management infrastructure. So that's obviously a piece of built infrastructure, but storm drainage, wastewater, water treatment, drinking water. Okay, so I pulled it out as a separate category. Emergency preparedness and response. This is our societal category. Assembly areas, disaster recovery plans, public education and outreach. This is another big one. Public education and outreach. I said it earlier, I'll say it again. People are getting funded to do public education and outreach efforts. That counts as implementation, okay? That counts as implementation. And environmental features. We've been talking about all these, but you've got a lot of really great environmental, ecological resources within your community. Bank erosion leads to the introduction of invasive species. Invasive species climb up the native vegetation and pull trees down. These are compounding effects. Warmer water leads to algal blooms. Algal blooms lead to decrease in water quality. Decrease in water quality can affect tourism within your community. Okay, so these are, the tentacles spread really quickly when we think about these issues. So again, just try to think big here. These are big solutions that we can come up with. Next slide. So what are we going to do? Again, we're developing solutions today together. We want to reduce our vulnerabilities and protect our assets to the harmful effects of climate change. These are our three categories that we've been talking about over and over. We want to make the most of any potential beneficial opportunities associated with climate change. This is about opportunity, right? It doesn't need to be this doom and gloom scenario. This is our opportunity here to address some of the known issues within your community with an eye on the future. Here's my co-benefit term again. I'm going to beat everyone over the head with this term today. Consider planning timeframes, short and long term. There's things we can do tomorrow, right, or things we can do 10 years down the road. A really strong grant application demonstrates a concept where you're thinking about something we want to accomplish in a year, something we want to accomplish in 3 years, something we want to accomplish in 5 years or 10 years. But again, when you can demonstrate that you're thinking about this process over time, it's really good for the community. This is the matrix, so you have it broken down on 11 by 17 sheets by categories, but what we're trying to do is this red box is your hazards. We've talked about hazards. This green box is our categories of infrastructural, societal, and environmental features, and then the body of this matrix is where we apply the solutions. So you will see the preliminary solutions, hazards, categories, solutions that have been developed by the core team. The idea today is expand on everything that's been done so far. Next.
So hi, I'm Allie. I'm also from BSC. And we have Kate and we have Katie. So we just want to make sure that that's it, right? Oh, and we have Frank. But everybody knows Frank, right? Yep. So just wanted to introduce everybody from BSC. So if you have any questions, you can ask one of us. But like Jeff was mentioning, the $5 million were awarded in 2018 for the MVP action grant process. Multiple grants have been awarded per municipality. Natick got 3 different grants, so it doesn't mean that you apply for one grant and if you don't get it, you don't get it. You can actually write up or compile several grants and submit them. Just because, you never know. You may get all 3 or 2 or however many you end up putting in. In terms of what qualifies for a grant, pretty much anything within the MVP Solutions realm of activities qualify. However, if you have nature-based solutions incorporated into your grant application, you're more likely to get more money or to get that grant. And that's because the state is really focusing on nature-based solutions. Now, what are nature-based solutions? Does anybody know what nature-based solutions are? It's a new term. It was coined last year, according to Wikipedia. No one has ever used it before, or not quite as a nature-based solution term. People usually use it more ecological restoration or conservation. The term biomimicry, you hear that a lot of the coastal communities with dune restoration projects, biomimicry. So it's pretty much any of these definitions really fall under the nature-based solution idea. So these are some examples that we have. This is a project that BSC did in Cambridge, and this is a stormwater wetland. So it's not just your typical stormwater feature where you have your riprap and your culverts. You can actually make it a functional wetland that looks a lot nicer to the eye. They also created some trails around it with educational signage. Here's your nature-based solution. You have a parking lot, you need some stormwater drainage. It could be something like this. We're also talking about green roofs. How many of you knew that Fenway Park had a community garden on the roof? Nice, that's great. Last community, no one had any idea. So something like that could be done. Again, this is a co-benefit. You have your environmental and your societal as well. And then you have that last picture over there is actually Bayou Park in Houston, which is a park that was created within the floodplain of the river. And the purpose of the park is to flood during hurricane events. So during this last hurricane that we had, the entire park was flooded. There was a lot of damage. However, when they designed the park, they designed it to have different elevations of walkways. So the park was still functional even right after the hurricane. And that kind of brought the community together. Everybody was checking in on each other, sharing information, sharing ideas. And as the water receded and the area got cleaned up, more and more of the park was open. So again, it's the co-benefit. You have your open space that can be combined with infrastructure that can be also a benefit to the environment. So these are some of the examples of the grants that were awarded in 2018. And I just like to use this more to get you an idea of what kind of solutions we might be thinking of. There were $103,000 that were assigned to bylaw updates within communities. So making sure that you have your LID, your green infrastructure, including in your bylaws, any kind of audits or reviews that you may need. There was a grant for that, multiple grants awarded for that. We also had direct action grants, and those were pretty high just because of that public education component. So several communities got grants for flood management demonstration, water conservation campaigns, ecological restorations, tree planting plans, design and permitting of road flood protection mitigation, and then this is the one that I love, implementing our MVP recommendations. So next one. Also, there's grants that have been awarded for modeling. So because inland communities don't have a lot of information related to what is the impact of sea level rise or climate change, you can do some modeling. You can look for some areas where you have a lot of flooding. This will help you figure out where the water is coming from, where it's going, and what's impacting flow. So that could then turn into a solution in the future. Feasibility studies and design, so actually relocating sanitary trunk lines, as well as additional vulnerability assessments within your water sewer infrastructure or green emergency power or emergency response, as well as even, this was also one that I loved, updating your open space plan to incorporate climate change and resiliency solutions. Right now we're pretty much done with our portion of the presentation, so we can have more questions and answers. If you have any more questions and answers, or if you have any additional feedback. We do have some informational stations that we prepared. So Jeff was talking about them a little bit. So we have the climate resiliency data website, which is going to be on this small monitor. So that's if you're a science, weather type of person, you really want to get down and dirty with the data. You know, what are the projections looking for Burlington in the future? You know, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 30 years. We also have the big monitor over here where we created an online GIS version of your community. We also have paper maps that you can look at. And with that, you can actually zoom into individual areas. Like if you want to look up your address and see what your vulnerabilities are based on where you live. If there's also information on there about the critical infrastructures that were highlighted during the MAPC process. I think it's a really cool tool just because we may be missing something on that viewer that you may want to give us additional information, and we can add it on right now using the computer. So we just want to make sure that we're capturing as much as we can about vulnerabilities, strengths, and potential solutions within here. Things that you know have been implemented in the past that have worked, like culvert upgrades or stormwater upgrades or anything like that that we don't have on the screen. It would be great for us to capture that information either on the GIS or on paper, just because we want to make sure that that's incorporated into the document that comes out of all of this. And then finally, we're going to have the solutions PowerPoint running on here. It's about 40-ish slides. And it provides very specific examples about solutions with co-benefits. There's a lot of push for the science-based solutions just because there's more funding if you have a science-based solution in your proposal, in your grant application later on. So we kind of harp on that just to give people an understanding of what that really means when you're actually looking at it, like a rain garden. Something as simple as a rain garden is a science-based solution. And then we also have some additional handouts. And I do want to say, for those that are on Instagram or on Twitter, if you see something and you like it and it's something, see something anywhere. I mean, I'm just thinking Wegmans has a lot of science-based solutions, stormwater features in their parking lot. If you go out there, you see something that's functional that you would like to see elsewhere in Burlington, you can snap a picture and add that hashtag. You can snap a picture and send it to one of us or send it to Josh, and we can incorporate it into the future plan or some ideas, as well as just having this kind of just to get people additional information for that community listening session. So any questions? Yep.
Curious, from your perspective, is this focused more on what is directly within the town's control, so like homes, other things like that, or is it focused additionally on, I'm thinking things like passive house, or I'm thinking about things like passive house standards for apartment buildings that would allow people to stay in their homes for a long time after the power goes out, because it's extremely well insulated. Is it focused more on influencing private decisions, or is it pretty focused on municipal decisions?
It's both. So this is your wish list. So we've gotten everything on some of the solution recommendations as gray water management and updates to gray water reuse standards within the state. So everything from policy changes to speaking to developers as well as managers of big real estate developments about some ideas and recommendations for greening their infrastructure, as well as the possibility of assigning grants for that kind of work. Then we have the municipal level. We also have the state level. A lot of roads are not managed by the town, so we want to make sure that those are also incorporated if they're an issue. So Jeff puts this as being a wish list. So whatever you can think of, we want to incorporate it into the matrix in some way with whether it's a vulnerability or strength and provide a solution. And I mean, a solution could be something more of a public education and outreach to the community or to the real estate community about what they can do for passive, what did you call it? Passive energy?
Passive house.
Passive housing.
It's a the standard project new construction work or renovations can be built, so that it's extremely efficient.
Okay, yep. So I need to be educated on that, so I would be one of those members in the community that would be like, I want to learn about that, because I don't know about it. So, yep, that's a good one. Good question. Yep.
Towns on one of those previous slides, they're what, 2 years ahead of us, or, and I see like Brookline grabbed off more than half of the allocated money for one particular thing.
So they're 1 year ahead of you. So they finished their grant cycle in 2018, applied for that grant, received the grant, and now they're implementing their grant.
Yeah, there were, of the 68 communities that received their designation in the 17-18 grant cycle, there were approximately 30 that received action grant funding. So that was that $5 million. There were also some communities that received multiple action grants. So Natick, for example, received $9,000 to do a tree planting plan, $16,000 to do a water conservation campaign, and $40,000 to do a low impact development regulation, development and zoning bylaw. Okay, so they received 3 action grants. I think Medford was another. Medford received 2 action grants. They received $60,000 for an open space plan update, and then the development, and another $60,000 for a drainage model and conceptual strategies to reduce future flooding in South Medford. So there's, again, the term wish list is actually a good way to describe what we're doing today. Think big and come up with solutions. What do you need in the community to address these issues through the lens of climate change? And there we go. What we want to do is we want to frame projects to apply for future grant funding. So to answer your question, yes, you're not 1 year behind. You're in the 2nd year of the program. So you will receive your designation in June and be eligible for action grant funding next year.
Do we need more than a topographical map to identify floodplain?
So,
what other thing you need?
No, not at this point. I mean, so the idea is that, we'll have a station set up over here, which has all the floodplain within your community mapped on it. But there's institutional knowledge in this room, right? So there's areas that that may have nuisance flooding, persistent nuisance flooding that doesn't show up on a flood map. Or there may be areas that are on a flood map that may not be a problem. DPW has a really good understanding of where water is moving around the community. We've talked a lot about this in our 14 meetings. So it's really you identifying things that we may not have picked up on already within our 14 planning.
I mean, the Atlantic Ocean may be 40 years away, but maybe Shawshene River could wipe us out.
Right, and again, there's uncertainty. That's part of the challenge with this process is we're all working within a great deal of uncertainty. Go ahead.
I just want to say that I think that the concept of extremes is really important because every time it gets cold, nationwide we hear, oh, see, there's no global warming because it's really cold. And I think that if we look back, a couple years ago, we had an extreme amount of snow. Nobody could remember that much. And then we had a virtually snowless winter. This winter's been pretty mild. Last year, we had 2 weeks at 5 degrees. Nobody could remember that. That's climate change with extremes. My girlfriend's condo, the sprinkler pipes froze, $50,000 worth of damage that took almost a year to repair. She had to fight through the condo insurance, her insurance. That's, to me, and by the way, during that week, we talked to all of the plumbers and all of the emergency repair guys, and they had never seen a week in their lives where they had so many emergency calls because it was -5 for 2 weeks. I'm wondering, do you know of any monitoring of that kind of incident that the state or anybody might be doing to keep track of what was the result of 2 weeks at -5 that we had a year ago, because that is an event that happened in people's homes. That is an example of climate change. It just doesn't happen to be in the warm direction, but it was quite catastrophic. I can tell you, I got videos of her apartment.
So the easiest response to your question is the insurance companies know exactly what's going on. And, you know, they aren't insuring people on coastlines, you know. There's places where they're not choosing to not insure people on coastlines anymore. Beyond the insurance companies, I don't know if there's data on the incident specific scale. But again, the important point is we can't look at a cold spell and a warm spell and a heat wave as necessarily climate change. We're talking about 30-year chunks of data. And, you know, we know that in the last 800,000 years, the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide was never above 320 parts per million. Last month, we met the 410 parts per million level. And this was taken in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at the Mauna Loa Weather Observatory in Hawaii. Okay, so there's no power plants next to it, right, that may be altering that data. In the middle of the ocean, we observe 410 parts per million. And in 800,000 years of data, we've never been above 320 parts per million. And when you look at they call it the hockey stick graph that demonstrates this, that rise is all occurring within basically the last 60 to 70 years. Yes, it was very cold, and right now it's really, really cold outside, right? And it's winter, and it's supposed to be. But we need to think about it at the global level. We're coming up with local solutions right now, but it's globally, it's really, 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 really hot. It's warming. Warming is the term. We are warming. You know, they were this winter a few months ago, around the same time of this instance you're talking about, in Chicago. This was that cold snap we had a couple months ago. They were lighting the railroad line tracks. They were lighting them on fire in Chicago because they had contracted to the point where the trains couldn't move. But in Australia, they were having the most catastrophic heat wave that they've ever experienced, right? So, you know, it's getting crazy. But this isn't really what we want to talk about either, is who's a denier, you know, is it happening? That it ultimately doesn't matter in this discussion, right? That sounds like a weird thing to say, but it's about identity. We see changes. Okay, and we want to plan for the issues that we know exist within our community through the lens of climate change. Anybody else? This table has been completely quiet so far. One statement from this table. Nothing yet? I'd love, yeah. Sure, what did the teacher say? There's no such thing as a stupid question, right? Okay. All right, anybody else? Good. And we're probably all ready to stretch and take a break, right? So, go ahead. Categories, yeah.
We look to the business community, we talk about the heat island effect. We look to the municipality to make sure that our infrastructure is good, culverts, water, flooding. And then we look to the residents also. Because when you talk about leaf collection, it's also up to the residents to make sure they do the leaf thing. And so my take from Mr. Sachs's point is that it would be helpful to understand what individual residents have happening to them from a climate perspective, is what a community-wide maybe education program would do to help mitigate that. And I'm just going to draw the parallel to the pothole system, right? So in the winter, my car insurance company covers my pothole incidents, but the town tries to mitigate that. And so that's kind of the parallel I'm thinking about.
Right.
I have no idea on
Yeah, and it's among the most challenging. So your comment falls in the societal category, right? And that's almost the most challenging thing for people to wrap their heads around, because we all know what a bridge looks like, right? And we all know what a wetland looks like. But then the socially vulnerable populations who are the most affected by these issues, they're the ones positioned to suffer the most. So again, maybe it's that outreach and that education piece. Maybe it's drawing upon public health data. I mean, this maybe addresses that incident-specific event. What about tick-borne illness? Okay, like I wasn't alive 50 years ago, but when I talk to my parents, they don't remember ticks in southern New England. Lyme disease. And I live in southern New Hampshire, and it's prevalent in southern New Hampshire, right? And it's migrating north. And they're doing a lot of research on the moose populations in New Hampshire and Vermont, where when they track the moose, they put collars on them, and when they stop moving, they know they've died. Then they go out and find the moose. And they're finding between 14,000 and 20,000 ticks on the dead animal, right? And like, that wasn't a thing 20 years ago, okay? And so that's a problem for ecology. That's a problem for public health. Go ahead.
All right, I chair the Conservation Commission, and every spring we get a series of calls from people at various points along named screens and unnamed screens experiencing substantial flooding. And I think on the commission we are of the opinion that being that we are the headwaters of three major watersheds, we have a number of streams that we know about, and there's a number of unnamed streams, we know about them, that are contributing to the flooding situation. However, it is not apparent to us that there is one cause. So when you're looking at all these solutions, is it a culvert located at the wrong elevation? Is it that there's not enough gradient between the stream and where it finally discharges into the Vine Brook wetlands? Is it that there's a narrowing in a stream causing upstream flooding, but it's not downstream flooding? So I think what I would prefer to see as a priority is looking at the causes of why the flooding is, perhaps additionally document from anecdotal evidence from the neighbors talking about what happens during flooding situations. But I mean, as we approach spring, we're getting prepared to have a rash of calls calling into the conservation, wanting us to do something. And my version of this is that we really need to assess the causes that are contributing to this, and it might be multifaceted.
And so that's an awesome comment. And you will notice that John Keeley, our conservation agent, is on the core team. And you'll notice that one of the solutions that's been identified on your matrix under the culvert category is a town-wide assessment of culverts. Okay, so these are the kinds of ideas that we're trying to think about. It's a great, we have to be thinking about specific locations as we think about these issues. What are the undersized culverts? There may be oversized culverts, right? We don't want to just say we want to replace every culvert within the community.